were only asked to express their opinions, without the Tsar being in any way bound by them. This was hardly a representative parliament, as some Slavophiles would have us believe. On the death of Tsar Michael, his son Alexis, a lad of 16, ascended the throne. At first, the youthful prince was completely dependent on his pupil, the boyar, Boris Morozov, who, misusing his power, espoused his pupil to the daughter of a petty noble, whose sister he himself had married, and heaped offices and pensions upon his own and the Tsarina's relatives. Plundering of the people and scandalous misgovernment through Boris's protégés was now the rule in Russia. Commercial monopolies in the hands of the dominant families hampered traffic and increased the cost of the necessaries of life. At length, the long-suffering populace of Moscow rose in wild revolt, 1648, not against the Tsar, but against his officials, and struck down a number of them. Alexis rescued Moscow with difficulty and had to banish him from his presence and exclude him from all public offices. Alexis thereupon appointed a commission of nobles and ecclesiastics to compile a new code of laws, July 1648, based on the rights of the Church, former edicts of the Tsar, and decisions of the boyars. A national convention in October 1648 recognized the new code, which was then promulgated in all lands under the scepter of the Tsar. Yet, notwithstanding this wise and popular measure, the land did not attain peace. Official dishonesty provoked new risings in Novgorod and Pskov in 1650, some of which had to be suppressed by armed force. To cut off the source of such outbreaks, the Tsar constituted a new board, which, under various names, had continued to the present day, being now known as the Chamber of Secret Affairs. To it was entrusted the unconditional execution of the Tsar's decrees. Only insignificant persons were called to it, for they would be blind tools of the sovereign authority, and thus pave the way for unconditional and unlimited absolutism. This strengthening of the power of the Tsar was of all the more importance because Russia was soon involved in a long and decisive conflict with Poland. The Cossack War sounded the signal. Among the results were the lasting subjugation of Poland and the ultimate elevation of Russia to be the foremost Eastern power. This change was made possible by the decadence of the Ottoman Empire, which showed itself in all departments of government, and first of that in finance. In the time of Sultan Soliman the Great, 1,000,000 ducats, about $9,677,400, could be deposited a year in the treasury as surplus. Under his successor conditions were reversed. The expenditure soon exceeded the income by as much as one-fourth. Thefts and embezzlements in all branches cooperated with the cupidity of the sultans, who needed large sums for their pleasures, to empty the treasury. Peculation was organized into the system. The highest offices, even the governorships of whole provinces, the princely dignity in Moldavia and in Wallachia, were sold at auction to the highest bidders. No wonder that the purchasers sought to make up for this outlay by exactions from the miserable subjects, who, with no one beneath them to be preyed upon, had to bear the whole intolerable burden. The oppressive burden of the taxes, the ignorance and indifference of the ephemeral officials, produced widespread poverty, misery and depopulation. The husbandman cultivated only as many acres as would meet his barest needs, for he knew that any surplus would be taken from him by violence. In all quarters were to be seen deserted homesteads and houses falling to ruin. The enormous extent of the Ottoman Empire, the length of whose frontier was estimated at about 15,000 miles, was an element of weakness rather than strength. In Asia, the empire comprehended Anatolia, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Arabia. In Africa, Egypt, Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers. In Europe, Thrace, Bulgaria, Moldavia, Wallachia, Transylvania, the greater part of Hungary, Bosnia, Serbia, Dalmatia, Albania, Macedonia, and Greece with the archipelago. The fairest and most fertile districts of three continents, from the Tigris to the middle Danube and almost to the Pillars of Hercules, were subject to the sultans, who, instead of using their unbounded resources to make themselves masters of the world, merely spread death and ruin over once blooming and vigorous empires. In the families of the sultans, constant strifes and bloody conflicts arose among the wives, or among their sons, or between the sons and their father. Even under the great Soliman, such conflicts had taken place. The Grand Viziers began to have weightier influence in state affairs than the sultans themselves, who succumbed more and more to the intrigues of the harem. The personal council of the Vizier constituted the Sublime Court, the highest political authority. The most illustrious of the Viziers were Muhammad Sokolli, who, through the Christian origin, rose under Soliman to this foremost position, and under Selim II became all-powerful. It was due to him that Turkey, under the weak Selim, continued on the whole to maintain its position. Sokolli's ability, uprightness, and toleration for his former fellow believers, the Christians, were commended by all his well-informed contemporaries. After ruling for 14 years, he fell in 1579 by the dagger of a dervish to whom he did not appear sufficiently fanatical. Under the Grand Vizier, and in conjunction with him, ruled the Divan, a body composed of the highest officials of the empire, and meeting regularly 4 times a week for the consideration of matters of policy, administration, and justice. To it everyone could submit his case. Its decisions required confirmation by the Sultan, but this was seldom withheld. The military power of Turkey rested on its feudal cavalry, every warrior being hereditary possessor of a fief, larger or smaller. The number of these spahis, amounted to at least 200,000, organized by districts, sanjaks, under sanjak beys. These again were organized into provinces, eyalets, under beylerbeys, or governors, the military leaders being also the civil administrators of their respective districts. The spahis laid the foundation of Turkey's greatness, but with increasing riches and effeminacy, they lost their warlike spirit. Recourse was now had to paid spahis, at first merely a sort of bodyguard, but latterly increased in number to 40,000 heavy armed horsemen. To these must be added the irregular cavalry, who instead of receiving pay, remunerated themselves by pillaging, and the Tartar, Moldavo-Wallachian, Georgian, and other auxiliaries. The total number of these horsemen was, in the 17th century, more than 220,000, and before firearms were perfected, they were the main support of Turkey's military supremacy. Meanwhile, a reliable infantry was needed. This was by preference composed of Christian boys who had been carried off from their parents and who, after being trained in Islamism and subjected to discipline, were drafted into the corps of Janissaries. In 1638, under Murad IV, this compulsory enlistment was abolished, and even after, the corps consisted exclusively of volunteers. The service was severe and for life, but the position was held in honor and was well paid. Originally, the corps had been distinguished for its brotherly spirit, order, morality, and devoted heroism, but deterioration came with the admission of young Turks, to whom the privilege of marriage could not be denied, as it had been of the stolen offspring of Christians. Thus, the military power of Turkey degenerated rapidly. The more disorganized the state of the exchequer, and the more irregularly the soldiers were paid, the more frequent were the revolts that sometimes led to bloody catastrophes. After the Battle of Lepanto, matters went even worse with the Turkish navy. The fleets lost confidence and no longer ventured out of the harbors. The Turks, brave and enterprising by land, had ever felt themselves awkward and timid at sea. The poverty of the government also wrought evil. In the first half of the 17th century, the Turkish navy was reduced to 50 ships, which were fit only for the pettiest services. It must be admitted that the Osmanlis did not understand how to take advantage of their triumphs on European soil so as to evolve an enduring national organization. Rigid and severe in its forms, the government was always alien and hostile to its subject races. Culture remained the property of the few. Individual sultans favored learning, but irrespective of some historical works, this was altogether of a religious character. there is a striking contrast between the literary barrenness of Turkey and the brilliant intellectual development that once distinguished their Arabian and Persian fellow believers. In the domain of politics, the condition of affairs was similar. Legislation was stationary, for it could not deviate an iota from the principles laid down in the Koran. The Christian subjects of the Turks were treated as mere cattle. No effects were made to convert them, although this would have greatly strengthened Turkey in the Balkan Peninsula and along the Danube. Nay, from pure selfishness, some sultans forbade conversions in large numbers to Islam. This would have involved the loss of the poll tax imposed on Christians and the conscription of their children. Revolts among the Christians were frequent, and were crushed only by the most brutal violence. The most striking proof of the Turks' incapacity for rule is the fact that they could dispense with the despised unbelievers neither in the administration nor in the army. Their hosts were mainly recruited from captive Christian children, and the higher administrative offices were almost exclusively occupied by Christians. Only by virtue of this peculiar system was Turkey able to maintain her integrity till towards the end of the 17th century. On the death of the debauchee Selim II in 1574, Mohammed Sopolli was successful in placing Selim's eldest son, Murad III, on the throne. He inaugurated his reign in accordance with the ghastly Ottoman custom by slaying his younger brothers. He soon plunged into the enervating excesses of the harem and showed zeal for nothing save the scandalous plunderings of his subjects. By this plundering he obtained the means for the constant largesses by which the fidelity of his troops was secured. Yet in spite of the deplorable conduct of the administration, his adventurous provincial governors were able to extend his domains in Hungary at the cost of Austria. Meanwhile another war broke out, and this time with the oriental rival of the Ottoman Empire, Persia, 1578. This state was hostile to Turkey not only on political grounds but also on religious ones. The Persian sect of Shiites and the Turkish sect of Sunnites hated each other. After a war of 12 years, peace was concluded in 1590 on terms highly honourable for the Osmanlis. Persia ceded to them the whole of Georgia, as well as the provinces on the southwest coast of the Caspian. Yet, notwithstanding this brilliant result, the Persian campaigns were disastrous for the Turks. Their best armies, to the number, it is said, of 600,000 men, were destroyed, and their finances reduced to a state of hopeless disorder. The ill effects appeared prominently when the war against Emperor Rudolf II broke out anew in 1593. In this campaign, the Turks suffered numerous defeats, and had it not been for the Emperor's frenzied passion for persecution and the risings of the Hungarians and Transylvanians under Bocskai, the Porte would have suffered heavy losses in the Peace of Żitwatorok in 1607. Meantime, Murad III had been replaced by his son, Mohammed III, and he by his brother, Ahmed I. But these insignificant princes exerted no material influence upon the course of political and military events. Ahmed soon found a formidable foe in the energetic and gifted Shah of Persia, Abbas the Great. This prince undertook to wrest from the Turks their conquests in the last war, and the real weakness of the Ottoman Empire was revealed. In the campaign from 1604 to 1619, all that the Turks had acquired since 1590 was lost. The Persian wars had exhausted the best strength of the state. The extent to which the decadence of the Turkish government had gone is shown by the fact that, on the death of Ahmed in 1617, the Divan, that it might order matters at its own discretion, elevated his imbecile brother Mustafa to the throne. In 3 months he was deposed in favour of Osman II, the eldest son of Ahmed I. The new Sultan was a high-spirited, chivalric youth, inspired above all with the ambition to restore the empire and his race to their ancient glory. But his warlike projects were not favoured by the indolent Spahis and Janissaries. The failure of a campaign against Poland heightened the discontent. The Grand Vizier, the Minister of War, and other high functionaries and officers were massacred by the maddened soldiery. Finally, Osman himself shared their fate, the first case of regicide in Turkish history. The imbecile Mustafa was replaced on the throne, where he conducted himself in the most insane manner. At length, the Divan and the army alike recognized that an end must be put to such a deplorable condition of affairs. In 1623, Mustafa was relegated to the harem, where he lived in obscurity for 16 years, and Osman's brother, Murat IV, was set in his place. Murat, though like his murdered brother a youth of energy and enterprise, gave way without restraint to his sensual passions, and thus ultimately wrecked himself. He humbled the insolent arrogance of the Janissaries by terrible and repeated executions. External affairs soon demanded his active intervention. Several Asiatic pashas rose in revolt, and Shah Abbas the Great of Persia was ready to take advantage of these turmoils to extend his own dominions. In 1623 he made himself master of Baghdad, the capital of Mesopotamia and the ancient residence of the Caliphs, and forthwith proceeded to further conquests. In 1628, luckily for the Osmanlis, he died, and his son, Sefi, was of far inferior capacity. Sultan Murat now undertook war in person against Persia, and conducted it with the fierce energy characteristic of his nature. He retook Erivan, Tabriz and Van, and finally, in 1638, stormed Baghdad, which was now little more than a heap of ruins. In the next year, the long protracted Persian War was brought to a close by a peace that left affairs very much as they were before it broke out. Murat now thought of turning his victorious arms against Christian Europe, which was rent by numberless conflicts. Christendom trembled at the threatening danger when, in 1640, the Sultan died, worn out prematurely by his debaucheries and passions. He had restored discipline and confidence to his army and order to his finances, but these reforms were based merely on fear, and everything depended on the character of those who should hereafter hold the reins of government. Ibrahim, Murat's youngest brother, who succeeded to the throne, was an enervated weakling. He had, however, able ministers who maintained the prestige of Turkey abroad, reorganized the fleet, and began in 1645 a war with Venice for the possession of Crete. In 1648 Ibrahim was murdered by the Janissaries, who thereupon placed his youthful son, Mohammed IV, upon the throne. The real masters of the empire were now the Janissaries, like the Praetorian Guards in ancient Rome, and before their power both the sovereign and his ministers trembled. The destruction of the state seemed imminent, but it was averted by a race of hereditary Grand Viziers, who, beginning with Mohammed Kuprili in 1656, and holding office for a quarter of a century, secured for the Ottoman Empire a new lease of life. The alliance with France under Louis XIV, effected at this time, lends a fictitious importance to the position of Turkey in European affairs in the middle of the 17th century. End of Europe in the Middle Ages in the 17th Century, Part II, by Martin Philipson.